welcome to another presentation by the London Transport Museum Friends. I'm Barry LeJeune, the Friends Chief Executive. This presentation is a little different from the ones we've normally done. It's in the form of a conversation between myself, Sam Mullins, the director of the museum, and Rob Lansdown. And together we're going to be looking back over 40 years, actually it's 41 years now, of the London Transport Museum on its journey from Clapham through Syon Park to Covent Garden, and touch on the role that the Friends have had in that journey. In the audience as we record this are members of the Friends Trustee Board and other key players from the Friends management team. They may well be chipping in from time to time with comments and questions. So Sam, can I ask you please to start us on our 40-year journey?
Of course, here we go. Great. Well, look, thank you for inviting us to do this. It's a little overdue because, as you say, it's the 41st birthday of the museum. But we had looked forward to a big celebration in our 40th year, and we got coronavirus instead. So we've been slightly prevented, but we're intending to kind of revisit the long and successful life of the museum, and this is a kind of great way to do it with the organisation that's been so instrumental to its run, particularly in Covent Garden, since 1980. So the story starts with the first vehicle to be actually preserved. The London General Omnibus Company put aside B-type bus B340 in December 1924, I think, and used it on kind of photo charters and publicity events. It's seen here, on the left, it was clearly hired out to the makers of The Galloping Major, a little remembered film starring Basil Radford in 1951 about a major who got a whole village to own a racehorse in the kind of Ealing comedy style, I think, but it's not a film I've ever seen. And then top right, of course, is the B-type at the Museum of British Transport in Clapham, where the museum story really sort of starts in earnest with the establishment of the museum, which of course had many of the star features of now the National Railway Museum within the former bus garage at Clapham. And actually more than one or two people on this call actually will probably remember going to Clapham. I went as a schoolboy, and the only thing that stuck in my memory was with the huge steam locomotives, particularly Mallard, on that location. Pretty much standard transport museum of the day format. Lots of things lined up with small labels talking about horsepower and the length of the chassis and so forth. That museum, of course, is broken up when proposals to create a national railway museum outside London, which was a Barbara Castle initiative, as I remember it. This was the first levelling up side of the levelling up agenda, I guess, to put a national museum in the north of the country at York. And Michael Robbins, a key figure in the early days of the museum, a serious transport historian, of course, in his own right, and a member of the London Transport Executive Board, made sure, he maintained, that the London material would stay in London and wouldn't go to York and join the railway collection there. And so it ends up in one of the Duke of Northumberland's spare greenhouses at Syon Park at Brentford. We've got very little in the way of photo reference for Syon Park, but the less than spectacular entrance, top left there, I believe this is the opening day, with Michael Robbins actually in the centre of that picture. The opening day was clearly wet, as there are a lot of umbrellas unfurled there. And then one of the early posters for both Syon Park and what was then called the London Transport Collection, and a collection of vehicles lined up was indeed what it was. I'm not even quite sure what the floral tribute is to do with in the middle of this quite well-known picture, but you can see it's in a most pretty unsuitable painted out greenhouse, at Syon Park, which is well off the tube network and a fairly long bus trip from Hammersmith. But you'll see some favourites here, which of course find their way into the collection, which we care for today. Rob, did you go to Syon Park?
Yes, indeed. Well, I went both as a visitor, but also when I joined in '79, I was there helping to decant it, packing up models and generally dismantling the collection that was there, ready to be moved into Covent Garden.
And Oliver, you must have been also involved with that. I think we've got a photograph of you coming up actually in the dismantled Syon Park. Or later, it's a couple further on. A couple of posters here, which very much kind of emphasise what you've just seen in the previous photographs. Really, that this was a collection of vehicles rather than a narrative about transport in London. And the posters kind of stress the vehicle part of the collection, of course. On the left, one for the Museum of British Transport in Clapham High Street, and on the left on the right at Syon Park. And then there was the opportunity to move to Covent Garden. The GLC was in the process of finding a new use for the listed estate at Covent Garden, which Westminster had done its best to clear fell and turned into a 4-lane highway as part of its kind of master plan for the area. And there was the famous occasion when the 200 and something buildings were spot listed by government, and the GLC take on the task of using culture and shopping and restaurants to kind of regenerate an area, which is we now take pretty much for granted really as a kind of regeneration process, but was then quite a novelty for a city centre site like this one. And this is from a portfolio of photographs that were taken just before the wholesale market moved out of Covent Garden, and in particular the flower market, which you can see here, lots of potted plants and bunches of flowers that were the stock in trade of the building that we now occupy. And here's the building emptied, with the former stands for the stall holders, which were moved out into the centre of the 1830 market building, and are there as part of the market traders today in kind of craft made items and antiques and so forth. The GLC held a competition for what to do with, in effect, was the kind of anchor store in the Covent Garden redevelopment as a regenerated city centre feature. And I believe Kew Gardens, amongst others, were amongst the entrants to use the flower market, but London Transport proved to be successful. And I'm not quite sure who the gentlemen in this picture actually are, but I wonder whether it's not people looking over as part of that competition, or maybe from London Transport weighing up what they were going to do with the new building, and appointing the London Transport architects to turn it into a museum, as you see happening here.
Thing to remember, it was an awful building as a museum. It was a great location, a perfect place, but it was a building built on the Crown, so none of the floors were level. So we had to build everything up on plinths to level off the vehicles, because it was designed to be flushed out every night. It was hosed down and flushed out the floors, and it was basically a glass cover over what was an open market. So it was not in the least bit waterproof, and it took us many years to get to the point where we had a vaguely watertight building.
Yeah, so we went from one greenhouse to another, to all intents and purposes, didn't we?
Absolutely.
So you've, let's just move on through. And then the great day comes in 1980, 28th of March, when Princess Anne did the opening ceremony at this new museum. I think I'm right, Rob, in saying that this was the first thing to actually open as part of that regeneration of Covent Garden. Maybe with one or two restaurants like Tutton's were there, but the central market was under wraps.
Central Market was still wrapped up in hoarding, but the market, the Jubilee Market to the side, was open. The little market that had been open for almost the whole time through. But yeah, no, we were the first kind of placemakers for Covent Garden.
So top right, you have actually from the left is Rob Lansdown, which is hard to recognise you, Rob, there, as the one of the bright young men who created the new museum. And then is Eric Wilkins, who was he press and publicity, Barry?
Immediately on the left, that's Ralph Bennett, the chairman.
Oh, that's Ralph Bennett, isn't it?
Eric Wilkins is the gentleman on the far right, who was my boss then, as I was working in public relations. He was the chief public relations officer, and I think even then the museum came under his general brief. But Eric is famous for many things, but particularly being the chap who bravely came to the rescue when the Queen opened the Victoria line with a sixpence that she had been given, which was to be inserted in a ticket machine, and the ticket machine rejected the royal sixpence. And Eric Wilkins put his hand in his pocket, said a little prayer, and out came another sixpence, which he handed to Her Majesty, and that one worked, and the day was saved.
Great. And then next to the Princess, of course, is Peter Stevens, who was the first director of the museum, and had come, Rob, from the Science Museum, I think.
That's correct. Yeah, he used to be in the Science Museum, as a number of us were. So Bob Bird also came from the Science Museum, whereas Oliver, of course, came from the Museum of London.
Yeah.
And so John Freeborn also. So in that left-hand side photograph, you can see John Freeborn, Peter Stevens, and Oliver Green in our Mansion House offices. It's you gotta the credit has to be given to starting this up as an enterprise, because it was a it was a difficult job to get going, because this was the first time the collection was really being transformed into a museum, and the work that Oliver and John Freeborn did on the narrative to turn that around, I think was actually it was a really good push to change the whole view of what was just a collection of stuff, to integrate a much more a wider narrative, albeit around the walls. And of course, you've got Oliver in the middle there at Syon Park, and Bob to the right, rescuing yet another one of the objects. That's the De Dion, I think, isn't it?
The De Dion chassis from a cottage in Sussex, I think.
So I mean, as a founder group, Bob came before I did, as did all the others. You couldn't have really asked for a more solid group of museum professionals to get the place going. It was such a heft to move forward, I think.
Yeah. And I guess the characteristics which got the museum going at that date are those which we've seen kind of pretty much ever since in both our times, Rob, really, huge amount of commitment and energy and creativity and just sheer can do.
Yes, and it was the determination about to create the institution, I think, that really moved it on. Everyone worked towards that single goal.
And this is the slide where we just embarrass you gently, really, Rob. A selection of slides from your 35 years at the museum. 37 years at the museum. All kinds of roles, praying for funding with Chris Gilbert at the bottom left at an away day event, I think shortly before we wrote the budget. That's you on top of the garden seat horse bus, I think, on the top, worrying about the Covent Garden project on the left, as ever in your work boots, and very importantly with Belinda Betts, who was designer for many years and picked up in particular that the museum had to be as good, if not better, than London Transport in its design ethic.
Absolutely. And without her determination, the subsequent refits, the 93 and the 2007, just really couldn't have gone ahead. She had a very good core drive and vision to move things forward. Great to work.
I mean, your role was kind of pretty crucial, because you seem to manage to do 3 jobs for much of the time that you were there. You were obviously instrumental in all the innovative work we did on cataloguing, information management system, and so forth. You were facilities and IT and kit, and often you were kind of narrative as well.
Yes, narrative and multimedia. Yeah. I mean, my original role for when I was brought in as an assistant curator was for audiovisual work, despite the fact the first museum had none. So yes.
And of course, one more name that we haven't yet mentioned, because we're kind of in the business of mentioning some key names at this point that don't necessarily come up all the way through this presentation. But Mike Walton, who had started by running the London Transport poster shop and was soon recruited to run the museum shop, and only relatively recently retired. Mike brought all his entrepreneurial and design savvy skills to create a shop that, well, is still today and has been for most of its life amongst the best museum shop, not least because it feeds so brilliantly off the museum's design collections. And Bob Bird, we've mentioned Bob already, but he has a very special place, I think, in the museum's history. A man of remarkably few words. He just got on with the engineering side of the museum, and for whom really is largely responsible for creating a collection that worked and ran, and that people could sit on and ride on and hear, didn't he?
Yeah, his drive to preserve the collection by operation, to make everything work, or everything to be only a few days away from working was tremendous, which is why he finds himself continually. Our collection was garnering all those trophies on various events, just because of the passion that he put into it all. It just seemed to have a way that meant that we had a collection that looked like it worked. It didn't look like it was a dead collection of objects. It was a working fleet of road and rail vehicles.
I remember when I arrived, I said to him, what was our kind of philosophy about vehicles? And he said, well, if it runs, it must be complete, mustn't it? Which was about it, really. And I kind of think that's nicely put and very, very simple. And then, of course, we need to move on to one kind of really key individual, particularly as far as the Friends were concerned, the late Brian Staines, who was a great chairman of the Friends, and of course was responsible for creating the corporate membership scheme from his role as in procurement for London Transport, which has been so important to our kind of business case as an organisation. And we've still got the largest corporate membership of any museum in the UK, which for a museum of our scale is nothing short of miraculous. So Brian was a brilliant underpinning of the museum's progress. And then, of course, Friends and Volunteers have been an increasingly important part of what we do, and there's a few key ones here. In fact, one or two people, of course, on this call. We have the slightly dodgy bus conductor at the top left is very well known to us all, of course, as the amazing Laurie. David Rudham on the right was a doyen of library. They always had the difficult inquiries box for David to answer on a Friday when he came in, but which Caroline and the others couldn't manage. The remarkable Bill Ivy engaged
Fred
Ivy.
Fred Ivy.
And Ron Bristow engaged. I think they're sorting out negatives, aren't they? Putting them into preservation envelopes. That was a very big project that was done at Depot.
And powered entirely by biscuits.
Yeah, yes, indeed. Well, you can't be too. You've got to give them something to keep their attention focused. And Graham Page, of course, great expert in his own right on tickets and ticketing. And Dave Taylor with the amazing. I always describe the Friends Bookshop as turning base metal into gold. The alchemy of the Friends Bookshop, which continues to be a real feature, and it's been his passion for a long time.
But it's to me, certainly in my life of the museum, it's been the encyclopedic depth of the knowledge of the Friends who you could always rely on to have access to the information that almost the museum was never able to put the same amount of effort into gathering. I mean, I know I've used Fred Ivy in the 90s. We were using Fred's knowledge of systems, tramway systems. I think it was for one of the big hypermap displays that we did, and the routes database that was spread out of David Rudham's work. I mean, these were phenomenal pieces of work that we couldn't hope as a museum to be able to do, but that passionate dedication that meant that we had these complete sets of knowledge. Just quite remarkable. The museum, it's not just the friendship and support, it's the fact that the knowledge that the museum has is kind of vested in this group of tremendously enthusiastic people who really have taken the time to learn. It's always been, to me, it's been such a remarkable asset.
It's interesting to try and get yourself into the heads of the people who set up the Friends. The trust deed was formally signed off in 1984, a couple of years after, 1982. And it seemed to me, I wasn't involved at the time, but it seems to me, reading the paperwork, that the initial focus was very much not on volunteering, it was on fundraising. I think we're going to come to one of the first examples of that a little later in the presentation, which was the horse tram. And it was fundraising for the restoration of that that really kicked the Friends off. And if you look at the trustees who were set up at the time, one of the first ones amongst the first group were people like Derek Ezra, who I think at that time, but certainly became chairman of the National Coal Board, Anthony Jolliffe, who I think later was a Lord Mayor of London. They're all big names in the sort of business city financing world. And I think the focus initially was on that fundraising role. But before too long, volunteering became as much part of what the Friends did as the fundraising, and so many people were involved. It's almost invidious to pick out names, but pick out a few of the favourite ones, and particularly the ones that we happen to have photographs of. That's one of the reasons why this selection's been made. But volunteering sort of came along second, and then of course what we developed into was an organisation, as well as being there fundamentally to support the museum through fundraising, through volunteering, but also developing our own programme of activities for a growing membership. So we started having meetings at Covent Garden, producing what was initially a newsletter, but is now quite properly called a magazine. And in the 40 years of, or near 40 years of the Friends' life, there have only ever been 2 editors of those publications. On the left-hand side, if you can read the small print, is the editor of the newsletter for nearly 20 years, Paul Garbett. And then on the right, a more recent creation under the current editor, myself of what's grown to be a 44 page magazine once every 3 months. And it's no discredit on Paul. Paul was doing what was necessary. He worked with the material he had. He worked with the means of production at the time, and that's just a good old-fashioned Ronioed newsletter. It conveyed the messages, but the world has moved on a bit, and we've moved on with it.
Yeah, well, you should take great credit for the magazine in particular, Barry, which is astonishingly good. That most recent issues is a corker. So we're going to look at the different stages of the museum, what we're calling Museum 001 in Covent Garden from 1980. I do remember going once or twice to the museum, but essentially, Rob, the story was on the wall around the outside, and the vehicles were in the middle.
Yes, I mean each vehicle had its own graphic panel that detailed its own history and its specifications, but the chief narrative was spread around the walls. So effectively, you had your back to the principal objects whilst you were reading that story.
Yeah,
but it was still at that point. I think it very much broke the mold of the narrative side of the Transport Museum, because the narrative was very rich in the way it was displayed and had lots of small objects in it. But it was we were dealing with the difficulty of a building, which in itself was great for the collection. It was able to house everything, but the embedding of the narrative is going to take us a while to develop. So,
and I think you felt that doing this exhibition for the centenary of the Tube in 1990 was quite a big step forward in that narrative development of the museum.
Yeah, I think it was in terms of the leaps that the museum took, we kind of, although we had lots of little special exhibitions that were mainly getting the poster collection, now the photographic collection, out into the galleries. This was the first time we actually took the step of we took away about a third of the road vehicle section of the museum and created this kind of 2/3 scale model of Stockwell Station, where we were able to put a full-size context for the City and South London locomotive and carriage in a platform with displays that were fully integrated the story with the objects. So it was with this exhibition we were experimenting with new techniques, new interactive displays, electromechanical interactive displays. And yeah, it was that great leap. I think it was a great exhibition. It lasted a long time and was what really influenced what happened in '93 in that change of narrative. And of course, it's this 1990 exhibition where you have the problem from Peter Stevens' past life in land transport in the Science Museum, where he wrote a very passionate narrative for the City and South London locomotive, which clearly showed its importance as a national treasure and how at no point should this object ever be disposed of or given to anybody else. So when Peter we were at the position where Peter wanted to put it in the exhibition in Covent Garden, of course, an argument was put to him to say, all these things have been said in the past about this object. And of course, they were referring to the letter that he wrote himself. So he actually had to defeat his own arguments to get it back into the London Transport Museum. But as such, partnered together for the first time, it makes perfect sense. And when I worked in the Science Museum, I walked past that Sydney and South London locomotive every day, and it had no context at all. It was up on a pillar. But for the first time, bringing those together, it suddenly made sense. It explained that revolution in the 1890s with the opening of the City and South London Railway.
Of course, we've still got the model bottom right, haven't we, actually, in the museum now?
Yes, we do, yeah. a lot of the assets from that exhibition are embedded, and we still do still use them.
I wonder whether this is a moment to pause with I can't see any particular questions. Anyone want to make ask a question or make a contribution at this point? If not, we'll move on.
So just add one thing, Sam. Oliver Green here.
Hello, Oliver.
Just to follow on from what Rob was saying there, I think something that did happen over the years is that there was a very good relationship with, in that case, the Science Museum. And of course, that's been followed up since, and other items have been transferred from the Science Museum to come to London Transport Museum. And I hope more will be in the future, because I think, that there's obviously an increasing range of what TfL now does, which goes beyond the underground. And I think that's been a really healthy thing, because it's meant that the museum has constantly changed and developed. And throughout all those years, we acquired more and more material, which we were able to make use of. We got the poster collection, which wasn't kept by the museum originally. That was all catalogued and sorted out and photographed. The photographic collection also came to the museum. And looking back, I'm just stunned that we actually did such a lot when, in those days, compared with the museum's relative luxury now, we had so few staff. I mean, Rob will remember that
Yeah.
Somehow we managed to achieve an awful lot, which has been built on since. But I think it really has developed quite dramatically over those years.
Yeah, indeed. Thanks, Oliver. Yeah.
Absolutely.
We'll move on to Museum 002 next. This is a picture that was taken, I think, at the Imperial War Museum when we were on site at Covent Garden and building the new museum with the donation of £200,000 from the Friends on the 7th of February 2007. I guess Peter's there as TfL commissioner at that date, and Ian, of course, was chair of the Friends. I don't know who the young-looking bloke in the suit is, but I don't recognise him at all.
I think that's the largest sum of money the Friends have ever made over in one go to the museum. But it was a substantial donation to a very worthy cause at the time, and I'm pleased to say that in subsequent years, generally speaking, we've managed to sort of pass over as a fair average about £100,000 year on year. Sometimes I think it's the same 100,000, because if we don't spend it one year, it rolls over to the next. So adding up the 100,000s may give a slightly distorted picture, but that's broadly the sort of budget 100,000 plus that we work to every year, which I know is an important part of helping the museum do what it does and providing some of the sort of core funding for bids to other people.
Indeed, it's always incredibly useful to have that behind us, particularly at times like that with the lottery, where having the evidence that there are other supporters for a big capital scheme like that was a really important criterion for their decision. Although I do seem to remember that cheque disappeared shortly after we'd taken the photograph, and the sum was wiped off it, Barry.
Yes, I've still got it somewhere. I think we do wipe it off from time to time and rewrite it. It probably is a genuine rubber bouncing check.
Indeed. Well, I think this is the first kind of major project which the Friends funded, which was the horse tram restoration, seen on the left as a farm office was it near Maidstone? I can't remember now.
I think so.
And then on the right in Old Portsmouth, where it was given a bit of an airing with a suitable cast of characters on the top deck before it came into the museum. And this might be one for you to talk about, Rob. Really, this is the next stage of the museum involves some pretty major engineering interventions, not least the creation of what you called the train table.
Yes, I mean the original museum had a major structural upgrade. There was a group of trains that are there now that lived on a steel structure that was punched straight the way through the basement to the foundations. So it had an independent structure to rest the massive weight of those locomotives, allow signals display, and at that point the City and South London carriage was there as well. So for the 93 fit, the aim was to create more space, make use of the unused volume above in the building. So basically, the structure that we already had in place was modified so as that we had the table could be separated from the floor it was on now, and over an Easter weekend, it was jacked up using massive hydraulic rams to raise it to the first floor level, and then structure was put in underneath. And I can remember when this was happening, everything had to be shut below. There was great worry about us actually dropping through the floor. So we had a habit of breaking through the floor when we were doing construction works in the museum. And this was an orchestrated lift. We had a lift master, a man in a sparkling white boiler suit with white gloves, and he would literally orchestrated the rise of the train table, guiding each of the 8 rams separately with his hands as operators lifted it up. We'd set up time-lapse photography for this. We were told it was going to take most of the Easter weekend, but I think, as I remember, it was kind of all done in about 20 minutes. So the time-lapse actually only has about 4 frames on it. Tick, 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 rather than the slow, graceful rise it was supposed to have. But this was a remarkable piece of engineering, and is kind of the foundation of where we are today.
Yeah,
that same table is still there in exactly the same form.
And I'll put this one top right in because it shows the bridge, which we also think is a very important part of those interventions in making the space more usable and giving you great views down across the whole kind of nave of the building, just where the flooring went on it, I think.
Yes. Yeah, indeed. That bridge was quite something. It did gain the spar. There's a diagonal raking strut that didn't appear on any drawing, as far as I recall, until suddenly it was installed, which was a bit of a shock to us who had to move things around underneath it, especially the trams and things that had to move behind it. It was not an easy thing to do once this strut had gone in. But then that was the nature of the engineering at that point.
So you had the slide on the right here is that spiral staircase that went up to the bridge level, and then the buses were kind of ranged around in front with the interpretive screens in front of them.
And in between them, the story that used to be around the walls in the 80s version was now told between the vehicles. We tried to get the narrative in these narrative islands between each of the objects. So as you were forced to walk around the objects to get that history, and it was written in a non-linear fashion. So as you could go to any particular island and get a whole story without actually having to go through the whole chronology effectively. Although that was something we discovered was really tricky in its narrative, that people desperately wanted a way around, and we'd very carefully made it so they didn't have to have one. And so later on we had to superimpose a route.
I guess we've popped a couple of pictures in here to talk about the sort of entrepreneurial promotion of the museum and the shop in particular. We mourn the days when it was possible to buy a Gibson for £50, but just shows the kind of brilliant use of story and collections in the promotion of the museum, which of course Belinda was. I think these are probably maybe all Belinda's posters, I think these. Did you do, how much poo was that? I don't know whether
I don't. I think wasn't. I can't remember. I have to say I can't. It was a busy time at that point. I don't remember much towards the opening of, of that version of the museum at all.
And as Oliver was actually referring to before, because there's a steady accretion of really important additional collections, which enable that narrative aspect to the museum. How transport has shaped London, past, present, future, to be developed. So we've got women being instructed in being conductorettes during the First World War. There's a great portfolio of photographs of Victoria Bus Garage, probably at its nadir, in the 60s, and King William Street, the private shelter that was built in the former station there during the Second World War. Just a few examples of the kind of things you can do with the photographic collection. And here's Mr. Gom in Barbados, directly recruiting bus crew for London Transport in, I think, 1956. And of course, the all sorts of interesting things that go on in the London Transport kind of social calendar. Like lots of organisations, London Transport provided all sorts of social and sporting facilities, which are very well represented in the collection. This is the London Transport Operatic and Musical Society, who were also called upon in 1963 to people the celebrations for the centenary of the Underground.
They'd also previously appeared as characters on the collection's postcards.
Oh yes.
So the few that the 1980 staff were on, and it was the staff who were dressed up and girlfriends largely. That was after the big push in the 60s when they were dressing up left, right, and centre on every single vehicle that you had, especially around I think also around the omnibus 150 celebrations. They were there.
Barry maintains it's not him in the doublet and hose stage left. I have my doubt.
Definitely not.
London Transport Musical and Dramatic Society. John corrects me. Thank you, John. Well done. And then, of course, I think certainly when I came to join the museum, what attracted me in particular about the collections was the way that we were able to move into the extraordinary kind of design heritage of London Transport, whether it's posters or architectural drawings, Johnson's original roundel, the Underground map, Marion Dawn's moquette design, and so forth, which just gives it an extraordinary dimension, more than the average transport museum can ever hope to have, because that design heritage is so rich and so pervasive. And we acquire stories and material from all over the place. This is Ken Garland, who befriended Harry Beck when he was at School of Printing, I think. He was explaining to some of the younger curators here some of Harry's work, and he was also presenting some of Harry Beck's original kind of working drawings, where he was agonizing over how to render, Leicester Square's interchange on the map and so forth. Let me come to the acquisition of the depot. When I got the job in '99, Ian Harkness said to me that the most important thing to do was, we've got the museum sorted out, we've got the new exhibitions of '93. We now had to find premises for better care of the collections. We had to look after our behind the scenes. And here we are, top left. This is the Depot Engineering Support Unit at Acton before we were able to get hold of it. You can see that there's one car, there's a subsurface car on the traverser that ran in front of the workshops behind, where they could take a single car that had got damaged in a collision or whatever into the workshop to be repaired. And after waiting a little while for the ructions of consultation and taking all the functions that were in this building out to the individual line depots, we got hold of the site in about 96, 97. And the lottery bid of 95 had enabled us to turn what had been a London Transport funded capital project into something a bit bigger. We actually value engineered it to make it bigger, as I remember, Rob, which must be
Yes,
one of
it
the
was
rare
remarkable.
Value engineering has never got the project any larger. But we did it because we particularly wanted to incorporate public access into our store in a way which, at that stage, no other museum anywhere, or certainly particularly in the UK and Europe, had ever done. So you can see the new building going up over the tracks on the top right, and how it looked when it was finished. And the bottom left, you've got the new story being added onto the fairly kind of rudimentary offices and mess facilities at Acton that we inherited. And I can remember waltzing into this huge empty space on the day, I think Dennis Tunnicliffe drove the Golden Spike into the track when we started work at Acton. And of course, I had promised the London Transport Board faithfully that this store would last for a century, but of course we've now filled it up and we're in desperate need for some extra space. But that's as much, I think, as success of it as kind of not only as a store but as a public attraction, and as a kind of operational depot for all sorts of vehicle movements, both rubber tired and steel railed. But the photograph on the left is my particular favorite. I can't quite remember when it was, but one of the early open weekends, we found ourselves coinciding with a Piccadilly line closure from Acton Town to Heathrow. So there were two enormous queues of people, some desperate to get into the depot, some desperate to get to Heathrow with their suitcases. And our great concern was that someone would get to the front of the depot queue and ask for a ticket to Paris or New York rather than to the depot. And we look forward to crowds like this. Again, we've been attracting something like 5,000 or 6,000 people to a depot open weekend, and we're hoping to do at least 2 in the next calendar year. And I think Barry helped me with these slides, but I think what I think we also realised having the depot would be to provide a venue for much more effective deployment of all sorts of volunteers onto both our kind of operational work, like the bus group at the top, as well as sort of brilliant bits of restoration, such as the Signallers group and the York Road frame, and then Ian Arthurton and the gang doing the Victoria Line automatic operation exhibit, and latterly Q stock. But we also always knew that we could only really open Acton with volunteer invigilation. It was too big for the museum to manage with its paid staff, and that, I think, adds a quality to the visit which you wouldn't otherwise have.
And it shows, I think, Sam, how in a way volunteering has developed, because as we were touching on earlier, in the very early days, traditionally volunteering was about guiding up front, a little bit of behind the scenes cataloguing and tapping into the knowledge of the friends and volunteers. But it was really Acton, I think, that just opened up all these opportunities to engage in so many other ways, develop exhibits that wouldn't otherwise have been there if it weren't for the technical knowledge of the volunteers who've brought them on board. And of course the Q stock, the big project which the friends in the museum are jointly pursuing, been a little bit in abeyance over the last year or so for obvious reasons, but one day we hope the Q stock will be back on the track. And that is a project, a very large project, very largely funded by the Friends, and thanks particularly to a very generous bequest many years ago now from a dedicated LT underground manager, an engineer, and early member of the Friends, Bob Greenaway. And it's really in his memory and with his initial substantial funding that the Q stock project hopefully one day soon will be delivered.
I think the only thing I'd like to say on that is what you don't get from these photographs is the intense level of professionalism that have gone in to those restoration works. The signals on the Victoria line, that when I was working with the Friends, it was both heartwarming and frighteningly professional. The level of detail, the level of documentation, the level of testing was superb. Bearing in mind that I've worked with people who make things work, not people who make things work the way they're supposed to. And it was an education and a joy to watch. And the museum has benefited from that kind of expertise being freely given for so long. It's remarkable and such a credit to all the Friends.
No, you're absolutely right. And I was surprised when I came to the museum how little volunteering there was actually compared to many museums of a similar type elsewhere. But it was Acton and the space and the facilities that it gave us which really enabled us to kind of open up, I think, on volunteering in a big way. And so we come to the Covent Garden project, the creation of Museum Mark III. We started work in 2005. This is actually the Covered Way, the archaeology being undertaken in the Covered Way. We were really concerned that one thing could really hold the project up and bust the budget was finding too much here. So we were determined to mitigate that kind of early. So we kept the museum open for 6 months, I think, Rob, while Museum of London archaeologists did the dig here. On the right, you can see the inhumation burial from 8th century, I think. London Wick, that was the kind of trading settlement of London on the bend of the river, on Der Strand, on the beach of the river in the 7th and 8th century. We knew that some portion of this building was actually previously not exposed by basementing in the 17th and 18th century, and that there might be finds like this, but we actually got away relatively lightly, I think. I think two cremations and one inhumation burial, round about row 7 in the current lecture theatre, for those of you who like to choose your seats. We were amazed how the Museum of London people just went straight through the 18th and 17th century stuff, where we were looking for all sorts of interesting remains of a hammams, of a Turkish bath or a bordello, depending on where you were in the economic cycle that date. And they weren't interested in that at all. They just went straight for the early stuff. So we weren't detained too much by all the interesting kind of walls and remains of kind of pools and baths and so forth that you can see in that middle picture. Let's move through. So we finally closed sometime in, I think it's late 2005. We moved the shop out onto the into a spare unit in the piazza, and we stayed closed until, as we noted before, spring came very late in 2007. Sometime mid-November, as I remember it. But we finally got reopened again. The kind of scale of reinvention, which I think would be impossible today, but we did it at the time. Here's the cubic being excavated, the piling having gone in down the sides, and the spoil being taken up that lift. We then stripped the museum out. This was the great strip out of all the old exhibits, and the previous version of the museum all went to Acton. It was lucky we had actors, actually. That would have been a really, really difficult job to do.
Yes. And of course, you've got Mike Beagley there in the middle, setting fire to the place. Mike, he set fire to his own underpants, which was just a joy. We laughed. He was fine. But his boiler suit smoked for a while. It was very, very funny. But yeah, that was a huge. There was a huge, incredibly well organised by Belinda series of moves. Everything was timed and coordinated to get out properly packed, shipped down to the depot. It was a very slick operation to clear the site.
And then it really did become a building site. After that, we've got a few slightly random pictures here of all the work going on above and below, having to protect really carefully the original structure and things like the glass balustrade above, because we're doing a huge amount of work on the outside of the building as well as on the inside. The view down across the bridge, which of course had been there for a little while before, and I think the next one, just takes you slightly further through the process, as we're beginning to contemplate putting things back into the museum as we finally get rid of the builders who were terribly reluctant to leave, as I remember it. But we loved it. We loved Waits, the contractors, didn't we?
Waits were amazing. They made this happen in many ways, but they owned the museum. They used to talk about their museum. It was our museum. Every member of staff was really well inducted as they came in, that the ownership was complete. We even ended up giving Jeremy Cripps his own staff badge because he did so many guided tours. He may as well have been identified as a member of staff.
Yeah. This was the famous time when we threaded the 38 tube stock car back into the gallery, which was then kind of essentially assembled around it because it was one of the very big early moves. And I think well, two things stand out for me. One was that the tube train got a parking ticket while in Russell Street, which was slightly ridiculous. Later rescinded, I seem to remember. And then I was standing next to Bob Bird watching the 38 stock being pushed in through the front door. And I said to Bob, God, that's pretty tight, Bob, there. He said, oh, it's at least a quarter of an inch all round, which was a kind of fantastic Bob Bird understatement. The new floor, new top floor, in and just about to receive the horse tram, which was introduced on this amazing ram lift. Rob, you were involved with this.
Yeah, no, this was Waits' ingenuity. Waits really just took on board exactly what had to be achieved and how key the care of the collection was. And they came up with this method by threading this lift up through the building and twisting the trams in around the arches. It was a remarkable feat of engineering and beautifully planned out and executed by Waits.
And a bit of the structure which no one ever really sees, the photovoltaic panels on the roof, on two areas of hidden roof, which I think are the largest installation of UV panels on a listed building at this stage.
At that point, it was the first time a Grade 2 listed had been allowed to have something of this magnitude. And also what you see here as well is the cap roofs. And one of our methods of trying to finally solve both the environmental heat issues inside, but also the water coming in, was to do this major refurbishment to the roof, but also to cover the original glass roof to just stop it from getting wet in the first place. It was the only way really to keep it out. And so we'd spent nearly 20 years trying to keep the water out. But yeah, this was a great milestone for for all grade 2 listed buildings, and I think has now kind of opened the gateway to grade 1 listed being able to achieve this environmental milestone.
And this is not very long before opening. I seem to remember we got so tired of the builders never apparently leaving that we had a weekend when we all came in and spent most of the time filling skips with all this kind of protective coverings and so forth from inside, just to get a move on, to get them out so we could get open.
Yeah, it was a huge museum-wide team effort.
Yeah. So we opened on the 22nd of November 2007. This was the website of the day. And we had a stunning series of events. I mean, we had 3 openings as I remember it. It's all a bit of a blur due to the Route Master cocktails, but we had Ken Livingstone, Mayor of London, and go on, Rob.
No, don't. I was just praying you were going to ask
Westwood.
me. Thank you.
Westwood.
Yeah, we forgot the first time round. And Vivienne Westwood, the London-based designer. So we thought we ought to share the fun out of formally opening the museum. And it's one of the great opening events with lots of stakeholders and various luminaries in the body of the museum. I can see Leon just underneath Ken's left foot. I can see a number of familiar faces, including Dave Wetzel, actually. And here's the first day of opening to the public. Big queues outside. Love to see a queue outside. The guy in the hoodie, I remember, walked straight in, bought some bus models and a ticket, and walked straight out again, as I remember it. But you can't please everybody all the time. Roundabout, we'd kind of reinvented everything as far as the museum was concerned with the new displays for CGP opening in 2007, and we kind of topped that off by becoming a charity in 2008. I'm just going to turn that one off. Sorry about that. I couldn't find a picture that really kind of does the business for this, but this is the board at one of their away days with Phil Swallow's Tor Valley, Battle of Britain, or West Country steam engine behind at Kidderminster. Rob, you've got a nice phrase for what the kind of becoming a charity in effect meant the moment that we kind of realized as an organization.
Yeah, I mean, it was this thing that it was the acquisition of a board of trustees changed the way the museum operated, but it also changed the institution from being an institution run by a group of incredibly hardworking, but kind of almost amateur in the way we would just try everything and get things done. When we moved to becoming to have a trustee body, we suddenly became a very much more professional organization. We had to answer to more than just ourselves, and so we still wanted to keep the fleet of footness that we had, but actually we kind of grew up as an organization, and that was top down from everywhere through the museum management structure. I think we just became more professional.
Yeah, I think it was a kind of bit of a coming of age moment, wasn't it, really? And I think the next big milestone was doing underground Tube 150 in a lot of the hard work went on in 2011, 2012 for 2013, with particularly with Peter Hendy and Howard Collins' help. We were able to put on a stunning event, as well as with David and Oliver's help, putting together a first new history of the underground, kind of as a body that shapes the city around it rather than just as a transport organization. And I think our relationship with TfL kind of grew up kind of around this moment as well. And a number of things come together, not least the restoration of Carriage 353, which had had a very interesting kind of history as a residence, as a military tailor's workshop, as an antique shop, through the years, and some brilliant work by Tim Shields in kind of doing the detective work when we began to take that carriage body, which had been sitting on a flat truck at Acton for as long as I can remember. And the moment when we finally found out which carriage, which Jubilee carriage of 1888 it actually was, number 353, was a good moment. And again, I think it's a nice example of incredibly kind of high standard and restoration done with a huge amount of authenticity and really good research behind it, but producing a great result that you can sit in and ride on. And it was part of the train in those big events for 150. And of course, the work was done for us under contract by Festiniog at Boston Lodge, Porth Maddock. And going with that was the first time we'd gone into steam in a big way with restoration of Met Number 1, and we did this with a public appeal. The last steam engine built by the Metropolitan Railway at Neasden in 1898, which enabled us to put this extraordinary event series, 2 weekends in 2013, from Olympia to into Earl's Court and eventually to Moorgate for January 2013. And here's the train arriving at Moorgate. World's media turned out. Peter Hendy, Howard Collins, Mike Brown were all kind of asked the same question, really, so that's the first 150 years, where's the Underground go from here, which is the question they really, really want to be asked, because it gives them a chance to demonstrate that you really have to invest in transport infrastructure in a great city like London all the time, and not just on a stop-start basis. So it changed our relationship really in many ways with TfL. I remember Peter Hendy saying to me in February, well, that was good. I knew it was going to be a success, but my colleagues on my leadership team now know why they've got a museum. What can you do this year? Which was a bit alarming, is it taking 4 years to plan this? But such a lot of, a lot of a bundle really of big projects all came together for Tube 150. And of course, I'm not implying that the Queen's one of our volunteers, but she did get to have a look at 353 at Baker Street as part of the particularly the centenary celebration, 150th celebration for the Met that year, which we participated in. Here's Mike Brown showing her what luxury first class was really like in the 19th century. But again,
I remember that occasion well, Sam, because there was a little lineup and Her Majesty was presented to a small group of us, because of course the Friends had provided, again, a substantial sum of money for the restoration of Coach 353. So I was privileged to be in the lineup. And we'd all been told beforehand that, contrary to popular belief, Her Majesty did welcome you after you've done your bow and your curtsy and your ma'am, to take the initiative and say something to her. Don't necessarily wait until she speaks to you. So I'd mentally rehearsed a little piece that said, I'm Barry LeJeune, I'm chairman of the Friends, and we provide volunteers and financial support. And I think she did smile. She gave a little smile. She didn't say a word. She just moved on to the next one on the line. So obviously someone had marked her card that I was one to move on from fairly quickly.
But again, we couldn't have done all those events without huge support from friends and volunteers. Dave's on the call. There he is in the middle. Much as we've done with steam events and heritage rail operations ever since, from the really prosaic stuff of washing down Met Number 1 after a journey. I remember that the train pulled into Moorgate, and the escaping gases and steam from the funnel had knocked out lots of mortar from the crown of the tunnel, and there was big chunks of mortar sitting on the side tanks of Met Number 1, and someone pulled one of them off and presented it to Mike Brown, who was then managing director of the Underground, saying, "I'm terribly sorry, Mike, I think this is yours." And then we move on. We were keen to find a position. It's kind of hard to remember now how how big the centenary of the First World War was going to be in I don't know, 2012, 2013, but we found a position for it in the sense of the buses that went to the Western Front, which was a bit of an untold story, and of course the women who replaced the men who went to war in the workforce, the transport workforce in particular, at home. And we ran a couple of terrific tours with the bus to both Flanders and to the Somme. This one I particularly like in Popperinge, where you've got a First World War postcard with the buses all lined up, and there's the same view on the photograph just down below, and the Café de la Poste can just be seen in the background. So we took the bus to the Ypres ceremony. I think you and Dave might have been on the top deck of the bus that day.
Quite likely, it was one of the most moving moments of my life, going through the Menin Gate. It really was.
We had there's a marvelous moment. There was a Belgian who was about 6'9", who was in charge of the whole ceremony, and he was going to give us the kind of call when to get started, because much to our pleasant surprise, they wanted us to actually start the bus up and drive through, but then he told us that at the last minute. And so there's this pause after the buglers had finished the last post and we'd done the ceremony, and Leon and I had laid the wreaths. The London Transport one rather brilliantly said in the middle, transport for London, every journey matters, which I'm sure is true for the 50-odd thousand who were on the memorial. And the man from the event said to me, "Where is your driver?" And Tim had kind of lost himself somewhere, so we had a very worrying moment while we turned the starter on the bus over, and then we motored very respectfully and quietly out from the Menin Gate with a little ripple of applause. And it enabled us to play all sorts of interesting games, looking at where London buses had gone as part of the war effort in the First World War with their volunteer bus crews. Usually two busmen who knew each other well would volunteer and go out together. And that then led seamlessly into the year of the bus, where we closed Regent Street and did a brilliant parade of buses from the horse bus to the latest electric hybrid, with somewhat 400,000 people. And there was that brilliant run, which Rob, you made a great film of, which we ought to really show one day, or put out on the YouTube channel, actually, of the run from the other side of the Thames over the bridge and up to Regent Street.
Yeah, it was a spectacular day. I'd love to think that one day that kind of thing could be repeated, but it seems such a lifetime away in COVID times.
Yes, none of those people have got masks on. Look, they're not socially distant.
Not one.
No. And I think the kind of stakeholder support and engagement that the museum gets is a terribly important part of our mix. Whether it's masses numbers of people in through the front door, whether it's getting the mayor along to your kind of regular dinner and auction, which the last time we ran the auction, I think we took something like 325,000 net away from it, or taking them on great tours of hidden London, or top left here is actually a kind of a sponsors tour of the Covent Garden site when it was being rebuilt in 2005 to 2007. It's a really important part of the museum's success, and one that we put a lot of effort into these days. We just pulled a few stats out to try and just illustrate the progress really of the museum from 1980 to today. So from as few as 160,000 visitors to something like 400,000 a year. It's gone up and down a bit, but generally upwards. Rob, you reckon it's something like 32 staff in the early days with all the front of house.
Yeah, once we were up and running, yeah.
And then I think the other thing which Oliver talked about a bit earlier on, really, that the museum developed pretty steadily, both the kind of collections it covered, but also in its functionality. So from just being a museum and a shop, to acquiring an education department, to the library, into kind of marketing, then fundraising, development, taking volunteering really seriously, been quite clear that we were doing restoration for operation, not just for stuffing back in the store, venue hire work online, and most recently, of course, the Hidden London programme. So it's a remarkably sophisticated organisation compared to the one that started out 40 years ago. This year we've done, I think, 13 separate departmental operating plans that add up to the plan for the coming year. And that just, I quite like the graph. The top one gives you visitor numbers. So even in the early days, and of course the middle, late 80s were the kind of high point of heritage attractions before Sunday trading introduced competition. We probably, do you want to talk about stay and pay, Rob, which is, I think, the peak in 1988, isn't it?
Yeah, it was an experimental admission system by Michael Fock, then director of the museum. He entered a partnership with NCP car parks, where we would get an NCP ticket machine. We actually had a lift-up barrier, but we didn't use it. So the premise was that you would come in the museum. As you walked into the museum, you were issued a ticket. And with that ticket, it was time-stamped, and you had 30 minutes to walk around the museum for nothing. It was free. But after 30 minutes, you would pay. So it was called Stay and Pay. Staff called it Stand and Deliver. And it had a remarkable effect on the museum dwell time. We were roughly around an hour and 10 minutes before that is how long people would stay in the museum before we introduced Stay and Pay. When Stay and Pay was introduced, our dwell time went to 29 minutes, 30 seconds, as everyone realized they were running out of time, having only seen a fraction of the museum, and would dash around to the exit to quickly slap their ticket down so they didn't have to pay to get out. So it was a little bit, we even had, I can remember having fights in the queues because people were having to queue up and then click over their half an hour free to get out. Yeah, it was an interesting experiment. Got a lot of, there was a lot of people came through, but it really was not how a museum should look at getting its revenue.
Yeah, directors, who'd have them? And then I guess moving up to very, very recent times, really, the Hidden London programme has been a really important part of recent new developments, particularly in terms of income generation. We were earning over 400,000 profit in the last full year before lockdown took that scheme away from us. And we've done quite well while closed with virtual tours and so forth. Underlined very much Chris Nix's initiative, both in developing the original tour program and now turning them into virtual tours and Hidden London Hangouts. And again, that kind of shift to digital that we've been obliged to do during COVID, of which this is the neatest example, I think. And I think this is a trustee group, although it looks like Di Lee's from the Imperial War Museum there as well, with Peter Hendy and Phil Swallow and one or two others. And on the right, of course, is the tunnels under the river at King William Street, which is certainly for me one of the highlights of my explorations of Hidden London with Chris. And then Barry, I think you wanted just to...
Yeah, as you've brought the museum story up to date, Sam, it was just an opportunity to sort of say where the Friends are at the moment. It's a bit of a difficult subject to illustrate because in some ways we haven't been doing everything we normally do over the last 12 months. But we have managed to keep things going. We've managed to keep our support to the museum. A lot of the projects we were going to fund last year have rolled forward now into this year. And one of those is to fund an engineering review of the state of the pre-Second World War buses in the collection, which we hope will still be able to go out on the road from time to time. So there's a piece of work due to start there. We've got projects to support the museum's library through a library management system, and part funding, again, as the means of securing additional support from other sources into some of the community projects that the museum is running, both with the local community at Acton around the depot, and also to encourage people into volunteering. But we have been keeping going. We haven't been able to meet in the normal sense of the word in the lecture theatre at Covent Garden or out in our programme of visits, but we have a very successful series of recorded talks, of which this will now form part, and indeed some of those talks have actually been recorded walks. So we've been keeping ourselves active. We've been keeping support on going to the museum and keeping people in touch with all that we do through the magazine and various other electronic means.
Yeah, and I can only join in the chorus really, and thank the friends for their fulsome support down the years. As you were saying at the start, Barry, you started out in terms of thinking that this was about a fundraising organisation that would help with kind of major projects, and you've done that consistently, actually, all the way through these years since the foundation of the Friends in '82. But then moved your canvas much more broadly into providing the magazine and a program of events that work really well for people interested in transport history in London, and that support is utterly brilliant, and one that's really highly valued in the museum.
Thank you.
And so just a little bit of focus. I think this is nearly the last slide. We've done all sorts of things we've only been open 10 weeks since 17th of March last year. Seems hard to reconcile, really. So we've moved a lot of what we've done online. I've talked a bit about Hidden London already. Things like our family programs, our work with schools, have all moved online pretty successfully during particularly the last 6 months, as the lockdown period stretched out remorselessly. Our online shop is running, I think, at 60 or 70% better than the last year before closure, which is great. And we've just finished filming a series for the Yesterday channel, at which the museum's very own Siddy Holloway, here on the right, who's major figure as engagement manager for the Hidden London tour, has done with Tim Dunn, the blogger and railway enthusiast, appearing in the ticket window there. And this is in the passageway, I think, under Euston. Is that right? Yes, it's at Euston, isn't it? So that will be broadcast, I think, in sometime in July is the date we're being given, and we think that'll be a fantastic opportunity for us to fall in behind a broadcast series that they're hoping will attract 400,000 or 500,000 views, with our own programs of tours, our own sales, and just generally bring the London Transport Museum to a wider audience. And so generally, where are we just at the moment? Well, we are planning to open again on the 17th of May. There's quite a lot of work going on in the gallery, a lot of new, bigger touch screens, bigger video screens for the donation board, for the social media area. We've got an interesting new project designed, put together at quite some pace with Central St Martin's, looking at London 2030. We're kind of aware that the future is probably blended digital and in-person experience, whether it's the Hidden London Tour program is a good example of that. We'll be back doing in-person tours as soon as we possibly can, but we'll probably always be wanting to do virtual tours to some of those places like King William Street or Brompton Road that are pretty difficult of access with a big group. So I think all the digital that we've learned in the last year, and we've experimented quickly and tried with, it's almost like we've done a sort of 3 or 4 year leap forward in the course of the last year, and I think that's here to stay. We're looking at new ways of working, whether people want to come back to the office 5 days a week, 4 days a week, 3 days a week, very little. We're just trying to work out what the spaces might need to be reconfigured to to be, and that of course will include the Friends office in that work. We think there's a sort of big enthusiasm for sort of membership and loyalty to organisations out in the market at the moment. The customer research that we've seen certainly suggests that. So we're looking quite hard at a membership scheme and developing the patrons scheme a little further. But we're really quite clear that that's the Friends membership is very much part of that pyramid of different types of membership and association with the museum. Arts Council support, TfL support has been pretty vital in the last year. We've lost something like 7 million of income to date. So support from the furlough scheme, from the Culture Recovery Fund, and TfL's very kind of clear support for the museum where they've been able has kept us in business, quite literally. We did face existential threat when COVID first struck. And we've been very kind of agile, and we've tried things, and we've been quick learners, and we've learned the kind of benefit of perfection being the enemy of the good, of just kind of trying stuff and getting on with it, and not aiming at perfection the first time. And we'll have to continue to be agile. I think it's very unclear whether the next wave will be substantial or not, whether we'll be staying open for the foreseeable future, or whether we're going to be stopping again. But we're pretty clear that the creativity and the commitment of our colleagues will continue to carry us through quite difficult and quite unpredictable circumstances in the future. And we're hugely grateful to be able to rely on the Friends in a similar way, as a source of volunteers, as a source of funds, as a source of kind of those deep wells of knowledge, which will be, I think, really, really hard to find elsewhere. So a big thanks to you, Barry, and the Friends for sticking with us during the past year, and sticking with us on big projects and big initiatives in the years before that. Many other organisations have much more troublesome relationships with their Friends than we've ever needed to have. We've always had a brilliant relationship between the museum and its Friends group, and long may that last. Not quite in under the hour, Barry.
No, well, that's the trouble when you start reminiscing, isn't it, Sam? We're all guilty. We're all guilty.
We could have gone on for much longer, actually. Yeah.
I'll just give you it's John Cately here. You were talking about doing stuff virtually online. We will have to take a view as the Friends. What we do as the coming year goes on and COVID hopefully disappears. We've had over 17,000 views for our virtual walks and presentations, which is numbering 13, possibly 14 now since last April. And you can't ignore that. 17,000 people looking at those things, and then we've got one actually is up to 5,000 now looking at the same thing, all through YouTube. And like you, we've had to learn very quickly, and it's done pretty well. So that's basically all I got to say on that one. So, but what a good presentation, Sam. Very good.
Thanks a lot. Yeah.
And Rob. Yeah.
I'm sure you're right, John, about the digital. I mean, we totted up Hidden London. The Hangouts have had 110,000 views in three series. So I think it's here to stay, isn't it? In one way or another. Oh. We've got members now. 11% of people who signed up for virtual tours, excuse me, are not in the UK. So we can reach an audience that we wouldn't otherwise be able to touch. And I guess the Friends were doing the same, aren't we? Really?
Well, we are. I mean, I think the great thing was to get Harold Collins from Australia 5:30 in the morning to do a presentation. That's at the Friends, yeah, which was very good.
I think the lesson is you have the best of both worlds. When life gets back to normal, you'll still want to meet occasionally, but you can do both. You can have a meeting for real. You can video that, as we have done in the past, and you can put it on YouTube. So you get both benefits, really.
Yeah. I agree.
And there is great potential for developing that digital side, isn't there? I mean, I was thinking particularly when last year it was the, I think, 20th anniversary of that great trip we made to New York when we took an exhibition there.
Mm.
And thinking that now you have a commissioner who's also just come back from New York. There's so many things that actually could be linked up there and developed. And, you know, the museum could have a number of international relationships via digital, which would really develop the brand, if you like, quite substantially, I think. And there's a lot of potential in that.
No, you're absolutely right, Oliver. I mean, we've done a hangout with New York Transit Museum already. We've got one with Sydney lined up. You've had friends have had Howard's talk, but we're also doing a sort of hidden Sydney version of a hangout at some point. We're doing something in Berlin with the Technical Museum there. So, and I think we actually also know that not only is that mix here to stay, is that what my colleagues call short form video is also here to stay. You know, quick pieces of video. If we were doing Battle Bus again, we'd be doing lots of little kind of short bits of video about, you know, the cylinder head coming off. Oh dear, look at the mess the gearbox is in. You know, lots of kind of short form little bits and pieces and putting them out in short order rather than waiting to make a fabulous film at the end, which which we did have of the parade onto Regent Street, but we don't have of the actual bus restoration. So I think that we're looking at in the marketing department about how this short form video becomes much more normal and how we do things, and equipping ourselves to, you know, more people to do the taking the film in the first place and having significant edit facilities so that you've in effect got a small TV studio at your fingertips to produce all that material on a regular basis.
Okay, if there's no further questions, can I just do a wrap up then, which is really aimed at the public audience, the 17,000 that we hope may see this in due course, which is just to say a particular thanks to Sam and Rob for leading us on a trip down memory lane. It's really brought back some good memories and highlighted some remarkable achievements. In all those 40 years, I guess the challenges have never been greater than they have been in this past year. But it's good now that we can be thinking of moving on to even better things. Before I sign off, as I normally do at these presentations, can I just say to anyone who's watching the presentation, who's not already a member of the Friends, we hope that what you've seen here may encourage you to join us. You see the work that we do. It is a great way of supporting the museum as it looks to reopen on the 17th of May. So thank you to everyone for watching. Thank you for staying the course. We may have exceeded your time expectation. Apologies for that, but if you've survived the course of the 90 minutes, you've had the opportunity perhaps to break it up into smaller pieces. Thank you for staying the course and join us again soon for another of our at-home presentations.